So I want to talk to you guys today about how being members of 751 helps protect your rights at work. Not just being a union member, which is incredibly important, but specifically the rights you have because you're members of District 751. Just a little bit about myself and our firm. I work for Shereen, Campbell, Bernard, Glitzen, and Lavitt. We're a labor law firm in Seattle. We represent more than 50 unions, not only here in the Pacific Northwest, but across the country. Our firm's been in existence since 1922, back in the time of the Great Railway labor strikes. And like I said, we represent more than 50 unions. Labor law is what we do. And we've represented District 751 for more than 25 years now. So as a member of District 751, you have many rights that other unionized groups don't necessarily have, and that workers who aren't unionized absolutely don't have. Okay? We're going to talk about those rights throughout the course of this presentation. What exactly do we mean when we talk about rights that you haven't? So before I start with that, sorry. Next slide. It's the afternoon. I need my afternoon coffee. So, when we're talking about protecting your rights, okay, your first stop is your shop stewards and your business reps. Okay, they are the ones who know this light reading material, front to back, right? They're the ones who know what's in this collective bargaining agreement. They know where to turn to get answers about questions that you might have on the job. They know who to talk to get problems resolved in the workplace. And they know how to deal with management to help address the issues that you have. Okay? You're going to hear me say this a lot throughout the course of this presentation. When you have a question, when you have a problem, when in doubt, talk to your shop steward. They're the first person to go to. Like I said, we represent a ton of labor unions, and the shop stewards and the business reps that you guys have here at 751 are some of the most dedicated people that I've encountered in my daily experience. So it's really impressive to see. So whenever you've got questions, these are the people to turn to. Now, I used to be a teacher before I became a lawyer, so in my previous life, and I always like to start my classes with a short video. So before we talk specifically about the rights you have as members of 751, I just wanted to show a quick video about how union members, you guys, have really helped pave the way for a lot of the rights that even non-unionized members enjoy today. So I want to just really quickly show you this video. It's called What Has the Union Done for You? And hopefully you guys will enjoy it.
All right. As you know, I've called this meeting to discuss the union situation.
Union situation?
Yes. The situation that there are unions and that we don't like them. We are sick and tired of being strong-armed by these communists, and we simply are not going to take it anymore. Here. These damn unions have bled us dry.
Yeah.
And it's not just our company that they've bled dry. It's all the people who work for us. Our co-workers. And their co-workers.
And our coworkers.
Right. Even those people. After leeching off corporations for all these years, what have unions done for us?
Maternity leave.
What?
Maternity leave?
Well, right. Maternity leave. They did manage to finagle that.
Weekends off?
Well, yes. The unions did give us weekends off. But don't think you're going to take this weekend off. Oh, we don't.
But we'll get overtime pay. And that's because of the unions.
Beside maternity leave and weekends off, what have the unions really done for us?
What about workers' compensation?
Well, obviously, workers' compensation. I mean, that's a given, you idiot! But seriously, besides maternity leave, weekends off, and workers' compensation, tell me one thing that the unions have really contributed to the workplace.
Fair wages, outlawing discrimination. And did you know union workers make 30% more than non-union workers? How cool is that?
Yes, and the unions ended child labor.
That's right. You know, kids used to work in shit conditions like sweatshops.
And don't forget employer-based health coverage and sick days.
I love those.
It's really difficult to have a strong middle class without unions.
Yeah, and you know, unions also fought to make laws protecting whistleblowers who exposed corporate corruption.
I mean, they really did that. Come on, who does that?
No one except unions.
Okay! Apart from maternity leave, weekends off, workers' compensation, fair wages, ending discrimination, ending child labor, fighting for employer-based health coverage, and protection for whistleblowers. Seriously? What have the unions ever really given us?
A workforce that runs this company and has made you a millionaire?
Bob?
Right away.
So just some context so you understand how important being a member of a union like 751 really is. Anyway, so what do we mean when we're talking about your rights at work? There are two different kinds of rights that we're going to discuss throughout the course of this presentation. The first one, the first category, is the rights that you have that are protected by the law. A lot of times people will call those statutory rights because the laws are written in statutes, right? So, and those, if you think about it, the statutory rights that you have are kind of a floor, okay? Those are the minimum rights that workers have when they're unionized, and those are guaranteed by the law. You get governmental agencies, like the National Labor Relations Board, that help enforce those laws, okay, in the workplace. The second category of rights we're going to talk about are the rights that are protected by your collective bargaining agreement. Sometimes I'll call that the contract, or I might call that the CBA, just because saying collective bargaining agreement over and over gets difficult. But anything protected by your collective bargaining agreement is above and beyond those statutory rights that you have as a minimum, okay? And so an example of rights protected by the collective bargaining agreement are things like overtime pay that you have guaranteed, double time pay, seniority rights, things like that. And we're going to discuss these at length in the conversation here today. So, why do we need to know what rights we have in the workplace and what rights we have as union members? Okay? A lot of times people will say, well, you know, why does it really matter? I mean, isn't our employer going to follow the rules? Well, your employer is certainly not looking out for your best interests, right? They're looking out for their own bottom line. And your employer is also going to hold you to a different standard than they're holding themselves. So what do I mean by that when I say a different standard? Well, one perfect example is with the Boeing Code of Conduct, okay? They call it the Ethical Conduct Guidelines. But these are the guidelines they have for Boeing's employees, right? This is the standard they hold their employees to. And they expect their employees to not take unfair advantage of anyone through manipulation, through coercion or threats, or through any other unfair dealing practice. So these are the standards Boeing holds its employees to. Who holds Boeing accountable to any standards of ethics or any code of conduct? If we don't collectively do it ourselves, nobody's going to hold Boeing accountable, right? So that's why it's important to know what rights we do have under the law and under the collective bargaining agreement, so we can fight to protect those rights and hold Boeing accountable and make sure they hold up their end of the bargain. Does that make sense? All right. So the first right we're going to talk about today is one of those statutory rights, and it's the right to be heard, okay? And as a union, you have a greater right to act collectively and bring a message to your employer's attention and to other people's attention than you would if you were just an individual employee acting alone, okay? So the right to be heard means not only amongst your fellow union members, but it also means the right to be heard by management, to bring complaints and grievances to management's attention. It means the right to be heard by the public and by the press. So when things go really wrong at work, to collectively bring an issue to their attention so they know what, for example, Boeing is up to. It also means the right to be heard by politicians. Whether that's actually useful or not is up for debate, right? But it's still a right you have. And you also have the right to be protected for speaking out and for making your points of view heard. You can't be retaliated against for doing that, okay? And that's because you are collectively, as a group, bringing forward your message, okay? Does that make sense? So we can think of a perfect recent example that shows how collectively a group of people can bring pressure on management, even without the kind of things we normally think of when we're thinking of bringing pressure to force an employer to listen to us, like going on strike. So recently, we all know that a certain someone who shall not be named mentioned that because he was not retiring, the employees would be cowering, right? Setting aside the question of why he would ever say such a terrible thing, what a terrible PR mistake that was, by acting collectively, by banding together, wearing the awesome shirts with a unified message that said, "We cower to no one," you guys were able to frame the message, to point out how outrageous this was, to show the public and the national press, hey, this is what this CEO thinks of his workforce, okay? And allowed you guys to frame the issue, make him apologize in an act that was covered in the press as well, and let you regain control of what he tried to do in that specific situation. And that was because you acted collectively. Okay? If one individual employee wanted to say, hey, my CEO is a total jerk and I don't like him and he's mean, that employee might have good reason to be worried about their job, right? Because there's no protection for that one employee. But because you all collectively wore those shirts, took this action to stand up and say, this is wrong, you can't treat us this way, you can't think this way about your workforce, you were all protected, and no one can punish you for bringing that message forward. So it's a really, really important right that you have. Another right you have is the right to engage in union activity, okay? And that means you have the right to participate in your union and not worry about being retaliated against. So your employer can't discriminate against you for being a union member. Your employer can't ask you questions about what it is you do in the union or your involvement. Your employer can't sit there and stake out the union hall and figure out who's going in and out and videotape you or anything like that. And your employer cannot single you out or retaliate against you for filing a grievance, okay? And if they do any of these things, that's against the law. And your union can act by bringing what are called unfair labor practice charges. We call them ULP charges. We like acronyms in the law, it's very common. But if your employer does anything like that, your union can act to protect your rights. A perfect recent example is when SPIA was going through their contract negotiations in 2012. They were doing marches and pickets to bring attention to, the problems they were having in bargaining. Boeing sent some people out to videotape who was on the picket line. And the National Labor Relations Board, that governmental agency that enforces the laws that involve labor unions, said, hey, wait a second. That's surveillance of union activity. You can't do that. That's against the law. Okay? So that's a perfect example of their union, for example, standing up and protecting their rights to engage in union activity. So these rights that we've just talked about, the reason that they exist is because it's solidarity. It's a group of individuals standing up for each other, for their coworkers, for other coworkers. And that's why you have those rights, which is very different than if you were just one employee acting by yourself. Another right you have is the right to talk to your union reps. Okay? Remember, when you have a problem, when in doubt, go find your shop steward. Nobody can prevent you from talking to your shop steward about a problem that you're having at the workplace. Okay? That's what they're there for. They're there to help you. They're there to help you figure out the right approach to solving the problem. If it's a problem under the contract, they can help you take a grievance through, they can help you resolve that issue under the contract. If it's something that has to be addressed within the company, like Boeing has a bunch of the EEO process and other internal processes, your shop steward can help you go through those processes too. So that's why it's very important, and it's important to remember that you have that right to talk to them. Then there are just cause rights. So there are two different kinds of employment. If you don't have a union, if you don't have a collective bargaining agreement, you're what's called an at-will employee. And what that means is your boss can fire you because it's Tuesday and your name starts with J. They don't have to have an actual reason to fire you. But if you're represented by a union like District 751, you have what's called just cause rights. That means your employer can't fire you without going through a whole bunch of steps first. Your employer has to actually have rules for the workplace. Okay? these rules have to be consistently applied. They can't have a rule for you and then not apply it to you when you do the same thing. Everyone has to know what these rules are, okay? They can't be vaguely worded and hidden in a mysterious book somewhere. They also have to do an investigation before they discipline anyone or fire anyone, okay? And if they don't go through all of these steps and make sure that it's all fairly applied, then they can't fire someone or punish someone, okay? I talk to a lot of people who aren't represented by unions, a lot of workers who are maybe trying to organize or, might be in that process. And they think, well, no, my employer can only fire me for an actual reason, right? They don't quite understand that they're at-will employees. A perfect example is this gentleman right here. He worked at a car dealership in Illinois. If you're an NFL fan, they root for the Bears over there. And he decided one day to wear a Packers tie to work. And his boss fired him. Now, besides personally understanding why you would want to fire someone for wearing a Packers tie, but that's my own personal bias, he had no idea that that was even a thing. And because he was an at-will employee, there was nothing he could do about that. Now, he found another job for people who appreciated the Packers, but he was still fired, he still lost his job. That's something that won't happen to you guys, okay? And a great example, District 751 has won discharge arbitrations very recently, where Boeing fired someone, and an arbitrator, who's kind of like a judge, sat there and said, well, wait a second, did you go through the investigation process? What was the rule? Have you been applying the rule consistently? And went through all of those kind of just cause rules that I explained to you, and said, Boeing, you didn't follow these rules, so you were not allowed to fire this person. And that person got their job. So it's a very important right you have because you're members of District 751. Another right is to union representation at disciplinary meetings. You may have heard of something called Weingarten rights. That's what this is, okay? Weingarten is a U.S. Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said that people who are in a union have the right to ask for a union representative to be with them whenever their employer is potentially going to discipline them, okay? And so that's what that case held. So that's one of those statutory rights, pretty much. It's established by the law. So you have the right to have someone with you whenever your company, your manager, your supervisor is bringing you into their office to discipline you, okay? Now, the important thing to remember about Weingarten rights is it isn't like when you're getting arrested and taken away by the police and they're supposed to read you your rights, okay? Nobody's going to go, psst, Weingarten, when the manager's bringing you into their office to discipline you, okay? You have to remember to ask for those rights. That's the union member's responsibility, to say, wait, I want my shop steward. There's no magical sentence to memorize or phrase to remember. Just as long as you tell your supervisor or whoever it is that you're talking to, I want someone from the union here. I want my shop steward. I want Bill, if Bill's the shop steward. Do you know what I mean? That's all you have to say. Now, your union has these handy-dandy little cards. If you're like me, you like to have things written out for you. It has your Weingarten rights written on it. So if you want to have it in your pocket so you can remember, oh, hey, I have this right. If you want to pull it out and say, I want my shop steward, in dramatic fashion, you can do that. That's perfectly fine. But this is something that's available, and I think there are a few of them around too. Something very important to remember. Now, if you're a Boeing employee, your Weingarten rights are a little bit better than just the standard Weingarten rights. If you're involved in an investigation of any kind, even if it's not necessarily just about you potentially getting in trouble, you can ask for your shop steward. In fact, when in doubt, what do we do? Ask for our shop steward, right? So that's a really important thing, especially when you're answering questions that are part of an investigation process. Even if it has a hint that maybe there might be discipline down the road, ask for your shop steward. You guys tired of all your rights yet? You have the right to a safe workplace, okay? And a great example is in the Boeing contract under 16.1. Okay? If you think that what's going on in your work area could harm you or could harm your coworkers, you have the right to ask for your shop steward and to ask your supervisor and point out the problem to them. Okay? other workers in other workplaces might have to kind of muddle through everything and wait for OSHA to show up whenever that is. Okay? But you guys have the ability to look out for your own safety and for the safety of your coworkers right then and there. So it's a very important right to remember, and it's protected by a collective bargaining agreement. Remember this super short book, right? So arbitration. Arbitration is a tool that the union has to help protect your rights that are listed in the collective bargaining agreement. Okay? Basically, when the company, Boeing or whoever the employer is, and the union have a dispute that's been brought through the grievance process and they can't straighten it out, it gives a third party, basically a judge, the arbitrator, the ability to help settle the dispute for the two parties. Okay? And the good thing about that is that the parties have to comply with whatever the arbitrator says. So for example, in the discharge arbitrations that I mentioned earlier, when the arbitrator told Boeing, hey, you weren't supposed to fire those people, you didn't follow the rules for just cause, you have to give this person their job back. Boeing had to give that person their job back. So it's a very important tool that can really help when things are at an impasse like that, right? And there are a lot of different things that the union can bring through arbitration, things like overtime issues, seniority issues, jurisdictional issues, stuff like that. You also have social media rights. So social media refers to things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, different things online. And they can be very powerful tools to help communicate with other union members, with other co-workers, okay? And the NLRB has taken the approach that this is another protected right that workers have. You can discuss things like wages or working conditions amongst employees when you're face-to-face, and the same thing applies through things like social media. Okay? It's just an extension of being able to talk in person about these issues. Remember, you have the right to talk about your work conditions. You have the right to say, hey, my supervisor Bill, he is awful. He is so mean to everyone and nobody likes him. And if people go and like that on your Facebook page, you're all protected because you're talking about your work conditions. Okay? And so, for example, the NLRB has had recent cases where people have been fired for doing just that, for talking about their work conditions. And that's because the employer in those cases typically has some kind of ridiculous social media policy that says something like, you're not allowed to talk about Boeing on social media ever. The end. That's considered too restrictive because that's not letting you talk about your work conditions. That's not letting you talk about your wages. And those are protected rights that you have. Okay? So the National Labor Relations Board said that those specific instances where people were fired were unlawful. Okay? So how does that apply to you guys? Well, 751 has a website with links to all these handy-dandy social media applications. The Facebook page, the Twitter feed. On Facebook and Twitter, there are all kinds of postings about the latest going-ons in the union, different issues that are occurring with Boeing, news articles about what's going on at Boeing. So it's a great place to go to find out more about your union, about what your union's up to, and to communicate with fellow members. Now, we could probably have like a 3-hour class and not even begin to brush everything that's in this book. So I'm not going to do that to you. Instead, I'm going to go through just some of the categories of the rights that you also have that are protected by your collective bargaining agreement. So these are not the floor of the federal laws, right? These go above and beyond that. Things like cost of living adjustments, rate retention, seniority progression, the ability to challenge pay rates for certain jobs. Those rights are outlined in the collective bargaining agreement. Also, issues related to work hours and seniority rights, seniority provisions, recall rights in the event of a layoff. That's huge, and that's also protected by your collective bargaining agreement. And there's more. So, educational benefits. If you weren't aware that you have educational benefits through your employer, I suggest you go pick up one of these green pieces of paper back there in the back. Your employer will pay for you to get a degree. Remember how I mentioned we represent more than 50 unions? I don't know of any other union that has that has fought for that in the collective bargaining agreement. That's the first I've seen it. That's a huge right, okay? And then to be rewarded by your employer for finishing a degree, I mean, maybe it's the teacher in me, but I think that's kind of a big deal. Overtime limitations. You know, restrictions on how much overtime you're forced to work. That's also in your collective bargaining agreement. Meal breaks and rest breaks. Here in Washington State, we're pretty lucky that there are actual laws that protect meal breaks and rest breaks. But your collective bargaining agreement outlines very specifically by shift when that has to happen and how often that has to happen. That's huge too. Vacation accrual. Vacation time that rolls over so that you can use it later. Sick leave accrual. You know, leave that if you're in the military, for example, and you need to go away to training, there's leave for that too. All very important. So, rather than expecting you all to remember the list of rights that I just listed on the last 5 slides, there'll be a quiz later. So, there's this flyer in the back that hits on a whole bunch of the rights that I just went over, a whole bunch that I didn't even mention. So if you heard something that you're like, wait a second, I didn't know that was a thing, go grab one of these. Take it to your shop steward and say, so, you know, that crazy lawyer lady mentioned this one right over here in work hours. Can we talk about that? And that way you can remember it. So knowing all that, are there any questions?